is going to focus on low-cost air quality sensors. And we are pleased to have EPA's Ron Williams available to give this presentation and to talk about EPA research that's advancing the development and evaluation of air sensor technology and helping communities to learn more about their air quality. There's still a fair number of people logging into the webinar. If you have not already signed in, please sign in with your name and organization. And if you have a question, please type the question into the chat pod. And once the presentation is over, we are going to go through as many of those questions as time allows. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Watkins. Tim is the director of ORD's National Exposure Research Laboratory, and he will be introducing our presenter. Tim?
Thanks, Lisa. I really appreciate this opportunity to introduce Ron. Ron has been at the forefront of ORD's research in this area of development, evaluation, and application of low-cost air quality sensors. This is an area of research that got kind of initiated in the first version of the ORD Strategic Action Plan for the Air, Climate, and Energy Research Program several years ago. And since that time, Ron has kind of, like I said, been the leader for ORD and advancing and developing this research area. I will say that we're just getting under the wire here. Ron is actually, after about 25 years with EPA, he's retiring at the end of this month. So this will be probably his last webinar. So if you have questions, now's the time to ask them because he'll be enjoying other opportunities as the end of this month approaches. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ron.
The leader has muted your line. To unmute your line, press #6.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I thank you for being here. I see that we're already well over 500 attendees, and I think we had close to 900, if not more than 900 as of this morning who had registered for this. So we know that it's a topic of great interest to all of our stakeholders, and that's the entire world. What you're going to be hearing today is about 30 to 35 minutes of what we consider some of the latest understanding of low-cost air sensors. I'll be sharing some of the work that we're doing, what we're seeing from others in the field, and try to lay out some of the future areas that we think are deserving of our attention and the world at large, because this is a worldwide phenomenon. So we're going to get started today. Of course, this is it is not just a U.S. Area of research. It is a worldwide area of research. We have been and will continue to focus upon three primary areas. And the first is discovery of sensors. There is not a week that goes by in my office where I do not receive multiple phone calls from citizens and regulatory officials and others saying, I need a low-cost sensor to do the following. What is available? The bottom line is that there is no single website, there is no single area that you can go to and get a listing of all the low-cost sensors that exist in the world. We find out about those sensors in multiple ways. We go there and are sometimes contacted by others saying, have you heard about this following sensor? It now exists. Sometimes manufacturers will contact us directly and saying, we've developed the product, we want you to be aware of it. And literally every month, one of the duties here at the agency is that we have a staff meter who literally does a web search, and a very particular web search to try to locate the names and locations and the specifications of all the latest technologies. That's not a public database. It's a database we use here inside of EPA to see are there sensors that we might be able to use in our own research. But the bottom line is that when it comes to discovery of sensor technology, there is no one single place that I can direct you to. That is something we would love to see rectified, but That is an extremely large undertaking, and it's one that we currently can't maintain or manage. The second thing that we do inside the agency is evaluate sensor technology. We are fortunate enough that upon occasion we're able to use our resources that are provided to us to go there and actually purchase sensors and then evaluate them versus reference monitoring. In 2012, when we brought a large number of people into the agency to discuss sensors, and one of the first things that were discussed was the fact that we just don't know that much about performance. In 2014, we had the Air Sensors Conference that EPA developed here in the Research Triangle Park. Many of you attended that workshop, and out of that workshop, we published a paper that said, based upon the best understanding we have right now, that certainly two primary ways of understanding sensor performance would seem to be evident. One is placing sensors in chambers and evaluating those, and then second to that is taking sensors and operating them in an ambient environment where there is co-located reference monitoring, with that latter being preferable in many situations because it is extremely hard to replicate all of the ambient conditions that one might encounter. Both of those have value, both ambient as well as chamber types of measurements. So we spend our time discovering sensors, we spend our time evaluating sensor technology, trying to understand it, and we in EPA are also a stakeholder. We are very much interested in emerging technologies of all sorts, from satellites down to low-cost sensors, and so we're trying to find the means and the mechanisms and the right opportunities to invest in actually using some of this technology for our own benefit, and so we certainly try to apply that. We have been and will continue to work along this paradigm in terms of what we see sensor technology moving toward. Certainly starting in 2012, we were one of the first to go there, and along with the Joint Research Center out of Europe, we really saw that we really have to understand sensor performance, which means doing peer-reviewed testing, a high degree of technical skill and knowledge, being able to do that. And you can see that under the past header there, we have been doing both field as well as laboratory evaluations using very specific test protocols. Those have typically been short-term duration tests, operating up to anywhere from 30 days up to almost a year for some sensors. But the vast majority of evaluations that we have been doing, as well as what we've seen in the literature, are typically short-term, and just that typically means different things to different people. Some might consider short-term a day or a week. Typically in our hands, that's about 30 days. We've been applying that, and we've also been taking data and moving data from our portal into the Air Sensor Toolbox. That is our public access portal. When we go there and evaluate sensor technology, or there is information that the agency believes would be useful to all of our stakeholders, we put it out in a public forum on the Air Sensor Toolbox. And I know that on the invitation to this webinar today, you had access to that toolbox. And we want to encourage you to continue to go there. There's rarely 1 to 2 weeks that progresses where we are not putting new information out there. And then we also want to go there and share with the fact that, again, we're not the only group that are doing evaluations. Again, the Joint Research Center out of the EU have been doing fantastic work, as well as the South Coast Air Quality Management District, the AQ Spec Laboratory, and very soon CARB, the California Air Resources Board, will also be doing evaluations. And we think that the more groups that are engaged in this, the more that we can look at comparative data between institutions, that's only going to make us all more informed. Currently, one has a desire to understand how can we use sensor data in a purposeful manner, and we see a host of applications under the present conditions. There are smart cities that EPA has helped funded challenges where institutions have been deploying sensors in the 200 to 400 range of individual sensors in a network approach, tying in local communities, academics, environmental justice, and other types of groups to try to use sensor technology in a purposeful manner. We see many communities are engaged, and in fact, we have a City area that we have funded under our air sensors work out of our STAR program, the Science to Achieve Results. And 6 groups right now are currently engaged with community-based sensor deployment. We think that's a very useful thing, and we encourage others to be associated with that. And there are many other types of applications. Later on this afternoon, I'll show you some of the many applications that we are seeing in the peer-reviewed literature, and they include near-source monitoring and community-based monitoring. One of the areas that we will definitely be working on, in fact, one of our researchers, Andrea Clements in our group here, has a project that will last almost a year where multiple locations inside of the U.S. Will be deployed the same sensors for up to a year and try to understand how well they are working under different environmental conditions. We have done that in some locations already, but this is going to be a little bit larger deployment. It's being done in concert with some of our state regulatory groups, and we're looking forward to that. So give us some time. It'll take about a year to actually deploy those sensors and then time to go there and harvest all that data. But maybe within the next 2 years we'll have some understanding of how various sensors work with long-term deployment. That is key, especially to sensors that have an unknown lifespan, like the gas phase sensors. In the future, we certainly want to understand data quality. We have been examining that since day one, but it is an issue that is present on our mind constantly because we are often in a regulatory type of data mentality where the data that we retrieve from our federal equivalent monitors and our federal reference monitors, if they have operated under our quality assurance guidelines, we know that they are trusted and robust and can meet the purposes for which they were deployed. One can't necessarily say that about low-cost sensor data. There are opportunities where sensors are going to respond not just to the primary pollutant, but other pollutants. We know many of the sensors are co-responsive to the environmental conditions, relative humidity and temperature. So data quality is an issue that we deal with every day in our studies. But I will say this, it is not something that can't be overcome. It all comes down to quality assurance and planning. And I will share with you that within the next week or so, on the Air Sensor Toolbox website, a new tool that has just been released by the agency, a Citizen Science Quality Assurance Handbook, will be available. It's already available through other parts of the agency, but if you go to the Air Sensor Toolbox, we are releasing a handbook that we think will be valuable not just for citizen scientists, but any group who are trying to understand how might I use sensor data, what do I need to do to collect it in a purposeful manner. So again, that will soon be out on the Air Sensor Toolbox website. And interpretation of data. I'll be showing you some information, some slides, some visuals about the great work that's taking place where people are taking air sensor data, low-cost air sensor data, and they're visualizing it, putting it out on websites. That has both pro and con features, and I'll talk about both of those as we progress here today. Data management. We often talk about the fact that if one starts collecting data at a 1-second rate, and you deploy for 24 hours, and then you extend that to deployment to days and weeks and months, you soon start encountering millions of data points. Are you prepared to actually deal with 1 million, 2 million, 5 million data points? Unless you have certain skills and access to certain mathematical tools, you may not be able to even understand the data that you have. So data management is something that we really have to understand. It's not just those of us in the agency. This is a worldwide concept. You have to be able to go there and handle very large volumes of data. And data fusion, how are you going to use this data? Are you trying to integrate it with other data sources? And if so, how does it maintain its original form and validity? That's extremely important. And certifications. Last year in 2018, we hosted a workshop here at EPA. We had over 750 people who joined us in that, about 200 in person, and that was a worldwide audience talking about how good must a sensor data point be to be useful for its purpose. And those conversations revealed to us that there are lots of different opinions about how well a PM device might need to work in terms of precision and accuracy before one might use it. Well, we have published a paper on that topic, the summary of understanding sensor performance based upon that workshop. It should be publicly available on the Air Sensor Toolbox as early as next week, if not by the end of this month. So again, on the Air Sensor Toolbox website, you soon will find an article that we have published in Atmospheric Environment. We're publishing it in the open access mechanism so that you can have access to it. You won't have to go through the journal. We're already going to pay for that, your ability to do that. It is important for us as a community of practice to understand how well sensors must be before that data is used. And so we summarized that, at least the knowledge at hand, last summer, and you will soon have access to that. So let's get into some of the meat of what we're going to talk about today. When we think about sensors, all of us have a lot of wishes and things that we are hoping for. We have started down this path where we believe that it may provide more spatial data. It also may provide more temporal coverage. That is, for those two, in time and space, low-cost sensors, you may be able to deploy more, and you may be able to collect data in a higher frequency than, say, for reference or regulatory monitoring because of their lower cost and ease of movement. That certainly has been a goal, and we have seen that in practice. I'll share about that. One would hope that with this type of technology, your cost would be lower. It would take less funds to go there and operate the sensor technology or networks. That would be a common goal that we would like to see. That it may not take skilled training. One might not have to be a highly trained technical person to be able to operate these sensors in a purposeful manner. That would be a goal that would be very useful for all of us, and that one could very easily recover the data and validate it and recover it in a manner that would be useful for one's purpose. There are many ways to go there and collect data. I'll talk about that today. And a goal that many have asked for is the ability to replace regulatory data. Now, I will say this, from an EPA perspective, we are a regulatory organization, and we use federal equivalent monitors and federal regulatory monitors, as well as those who support EPA, like our state regulatory agencies, municipal regulatory agencies, and only those data from regulatory monitors can be used for specific purposes, like attainment and risk assessment. But that doesn't mean that low-cost sensor data cannot be used in a purposeful manner. That is allowed under a number of mechanisms, but there are restrictions within EPA and in other regulatory organizations around the world. But again, we'll talk about some of those uses. One doesn't have to go to the full extent of regulatory monitoring to be able to go there and use data with purpose. So let's talk about that later on. Being able to go there and use air quality monitoring, one of the goals has always been that the world at large would be able to collect data, and then that data would be useful for lots of purposes by citizens and others. And we've seen this in practice, but we'll talk about some of the pros and cons. And certainly many of the developing countries would like to be able to go there and use low-cost sensors in place of the more expensive regulatory monitoring, where one might have to have a large infrastructure of skilled people and technology and other types of services to be able to deploy monitoring. And there's been a number of workshops over the last 2 years that have talked about this. We know that it is a goal of developing countries to be able to collect data where heretofore they have not been able to collect data. So that certainly would be a worthwhile goal if it could be done with purpose. And also, one would love to be able to see low-cost sensor data being used, again, as one of the varieties of uses, like for epidemiology and risk assessments. Again, within EPA, there are certain things that we have to do for regulatory purposes where regulatory monitoring is required, but academics and others are already starting to use low-cost sensor data in some of their epidemiological studies. This is the Purple Air Network. It's just one of many data portals that now exist. Again, this is just an example. As you can see, one of the things that we had asked as far as one of the goals that the world had talked about was being able to go there and see data from multiple sites. And certainly for particulate matter monitoring, we see many websites that are available around the world that are publicizing real-time data collections of particulate matter. One thing that I can say about this particular network is that, one, makes it very easy for the end users if they're using this particular sensor. And keep in mind that any technology that you hear today is not a pledge of endorsement or so forth from EPA. I'm just giving you examples, but the Purple Air Network is one that is widely available, and people can find this useful. In other words, if one might consider that there are green bullets and there are red balloons there, one might say, based upon whatever description this particular network is using, there may be differences in concentration between the red and the green. One of the things that I want you to understand is that there's difference between reporting data and reporting data that have been fully calibrated or formally normalized to other standards. And most of the data that we see on public websites are data that are coming from networks that have not undergone quality assurance guidelines. That is, the data haven't been changed or altered in any way to reflect, let's say, what a reference monitor might say. But data like this is certainly usable because you can see in very quick fashion that there are potential differences. Second thing, I always look at these types of plots with in mind that the plots themselves are useful. That is, there's red and green and orange and purple. But I don't necessarily use the numbers that are on screen as what, if I had a reference monitor in that location, that number would probably be different, and in many cases it could be drastically different. So we always share with our stakeholders that use these for your benefit, but understand they don't typically represent what a regulatory monitor might provide. There are typically far less vendor and open access portals showing NO2, SO2, CO, and VOC type of data. There's really just a small number. Here you can see one example. So again, going back to that last slide, far more PM sensor data that's out there as compared to other criteria pollutant. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One, in short answer, there's more PM sensors that have been purchased and out there. But likewise, more people tend to be interested in particulate matter than as compared to CO or SO2 and elsewise. But here's another example of a data portal that is available. We said earlier that a lot of people are interested in spatial and temporal coverage, and keep in mind that how one views data is extremely important. Here you can see data collected here by my laboratory here at EPA, and if one's tried to go there and understand how well data is comparing to a reference monitor, if I'm looking at 24-hour data and plotting it versus reference monitors versus 5-minute data versus a reference monitor, well, there's certainly more detail in that 5-minute comparison versus 24 hours. That being said, please be aware that for reference monitors and regulatory monitors, those represent a certain level of time allotment. In other words, our EPA federal reference monitors are typically 24 hours. So if I try to use data from a monitor where its standard is a 24-hour basis, and I'm trying to compare that, let's say, with a 1-minute reading from that monitor, even though it's a federal reference monitor or federal equivalent monitor, it's using that data in an off-branding sort of way. So be aware of that. You certainly have to understand the data that you're using and its how it was originally defined by any regulatory organization. So this just gives you an idea about the spread that one might see. Understand the potential use of the data when it was first created. Some of the other considerations that we're seeing about that, again, is the fact that are you prepared to go there and actually handle millions and millions of data points? Even just collecting 1-second data for just a week represents 600,000 1-second data ports. Most of the common spreadsheets like Excel or other types of spreadsheets, one, they may not be able to handle that, and two, are you physically capable of looking at line by line? There are a number of sophisticated software packages, tools like Python, MATLAB, R, S+, SAS, which may cost $2,000 to $5,000 per year for you to access. You then have to have people who are skilled in actually developing code or using code to actually use that. So we tell people, you have to understand before you start collecting that data, do you have the ability to actually manipulate it? One of the things that will be forthcoming is that just in the last week or two, I'm hearing that groups like the South Coast Air Quality Management Division District may soon be releasing tools based for one of the more common software packages. R is an open access package, and a number of groups, including EPA, we've been working on developing tools associated with R code. We have our RSIG platform, but the South Coast, I believe, will soon be releasing a tools package for citizens using that common data manipulation. That would be a wonderful thing because, again, a lot of the things that we try to do, like comparing sensor day versus co-located reference monitors, code can exist and typically does exist for doing that. So I'd invite you to stay tuned for the South Coast and when they may release that. We've said this and we'll continue to say it. Low-cost monitors are not perfect, and in fact, they come almost inherently with bias and noise. Typically, that bias and noise is undefined. Typically, the manufacturer has not defined it, and it will vary often depending upon where you use it. How old is that sensor? A 1-month-old sensor may have different bias and noise and drift as compared to a sensor that is 6 months old. So one cannot assume that whatever those quality assurance indicators are of bias and drift, accuracy, even precision, will stay consistent over the course of the lifetime of sensor technology. It's an awful lot to expect that if you invest $100 in a piece of sensor technology, that is providing the same benefit 3 to 5 years down the road. That would not really be reasonable, and so keep in mind that you're purchasing a low-cost device. It has certain benefits and ability to do things, but most of this technology is not meant for very long-term deployment like for our reference monitors. There's always been a goal for this technology to be inexpensive. We've seen that since the onset, and many of these technologies can be obtained for as little as $100. We typically say low cost represents the genre, the category of sensors under $2,500 US, and that's not a legal term. It's just a term that we have applied here at EPA because the vast majority of citizens and community groups that make contact with those of us here at EPA, when we ask them how much money, how much funding do you have to invest in sensor technology, it has been with rare exception that it is more than just a couple $100, typically $1,000. So we've put at an upper end $2,500 as just a capstone of the nomenclature. But again, that's not a legal term. One would like to go there and see that you don't have to have a lot of technical support to operate this sensor technology. That is true in some instances, but I'm going to show you and define for you that that's not always the case. Again, you're purchasing a low-cost device. You may not be purchasing a maintenance plan or even technical troubleshooting when you only spend fairly small amount of resources on it. One would love to see these sensors last for a long time, but currently we see lifespans of about 1 to 3 years for PM sensors. Gas phase sensors in our hands in our testing protocols have lasted on the order of 6 months to about a year. Now keep in mind that especially for the gas phase sensors, that doesn't necessarily mean that they just literally stop working at 1 year or that they even just stop working at 6 months. But we typically do see a degradation of response as early as 6 months in our field deployments. There may be unforeseen costs when you use this technology. You may have to purchase a cellular data plan. You may have to have a local Wi-Fi hotspot. You may have to purchase access to a data portal through the vendor who sold you the device. And we see those typically in the $100 to $200 per year. So keep that in mind that sometimes when you're buying this technology, you also have to buy supplemental resources where you can actually use it. So it is something that we see. And you have to understand that you have to have, again, the ability to analyze this data. You do not want to collect millions of data points and then not have any means to visualize or understand the data or the data quality. So other aspects of operating the sensor technology include the skill levels. for our reference monitors, for our equivalent monitors, even for our research grade monitors here in EPA, states, and regions, we have people who are highly trained. They know what to look for. They have quality assurance backgrounds, and they have quality assurance trainings, and they are constantly looking at the data to understand, is the monitor performing as it was intended? Is it meeting our data quality requirements? That is not always the case in many stakeholders that we talk to on a public basis. They typically don't have skilled operators who can do that. But I can tell you that it is extremely important to be able to not only understand that data, but be able to go there and understand, can we use it for the purpose that it was required? Point number two, data is going to be produced. These sensors typically have the ability to operate. But again, going back to a point that will be reiterated multiple times a day, do you have the wherewithal to do quality assurance on that data and then visualize it or use it in some purpose that is valuable to you? That typically requires a team of people having lots of different skills to make that happen. Again, you have to have the ability to process that data. So here are some of those processes I was telling you about earlier on. And again, you may actually have to develop, using computer script, quality assurance code that will actually look at those millions of data points and actually go there and do an analysis on the data and actually reveal to you where there are failure in the data, pinpointing out for you data that is not valid or outliers. You typically cannot do that just visualizing it by looking at it. You need a routine to look at. Let's look. Here's an example. Here's a study that I did in Puerto Rico. We were working with an environmental justice group. These are 10 sensors operating side by side at a reference monitoring site. The lower line represents 9 monitors, and you can see they are virtually one on top of another. It's a perfect union of 9 monitors reporting the same effect. But then there's the blue line. The blue line represents a monitor purchased at the same time, cleared through our laboratories for initial use into the field, and you can see that its response is drastically different than the other 9. And here's what I always say when I show you this slide. What if you were the citizen? Now that blue line represents what we would call an outlier. It is not performing as compared to the other sensors that are exactly the same. What if you were the citizen or the community group that purchased the sensor that produced the blue line? How are you going to know that that line is really different than all the other sensors if they was operating in that same time? In many cases, you're not. And so quality assurance comes into play. How are you going to go there and vet your data? Because here, even under EPA use, here's an example of where sensors all manufactured at the same time, all meeting our initial quality assurance review, that is, are these sensors working? When deployed into the field, one worked drastically different. And we would say that blue line there has no value for understanding the local environment. Here's a second case. This happens to be a total VOC sensor that might look for things like benzene and toluene, gaseous copollutants. And this is a comparison between the output of that sensor and temperature. And if you can look, that not only is there not just a straight line, that would be the perfect situation where over a wide range of temperature, the sensor didn't respond differently. Here you see quite a range of responses from that sensor. And in fact, not only do you see a range, you see different lines progressing from that sensor. Again, what if you're that user who happened to be operating the sensor where there's approximately about 23.5 degrees of temperature, and you were trying to compare the use of that sensor as compared to, say, if you operated it at 35 degrees. Note there is a drastically different, almost 2 to 3-fold difference in how that sensor responded based upon the temperature. And note also that it wasn't uniform. And so again, you have to develop the framework of your quality assurance so that you can be looking for these abnormal events, because in our experience, they're going to happen. Here's another example. This happens to be a Carepol Care Clip sensor. We've used quite a few of these in many of our studies. They appear to be quite useful in many situations. But you can see that here is an output, and note in one column the number is 255. Well, let's just say if you had a statistical routine that said make sure that there is a number in that particular column, it would see 255 and say, well, that's a number, and maybe that's a real value. But what we were observing was that number 255 being there and being there for hours and hours and hours. It's actually a number indicative of a failure of the sensor. So again, you have to be looking at the data not just to see is there a number in a column, that the number is of the right length. Let's say you're looking for 3 digits or 5 digits. You have to have a trained eye to understand, is the data reasonable? Because here's an example, again, in sensors being operated by EPA where the sensor provided the value, but that value, based upon our trained eye, we know that is not a real number. That is a number indicating the failure of the sensor. Let's talk about data transmissions. Even though a lot of the sensor technology that is widely available talks about ease of data transmissions, again, Wi-Fi, cellular, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be successful doing that. What if there is a particular cell phone plan that is needed? That is, there is a particular vendor who their SIM card has to be used in your technology. What if you live in a metropolitan area or a rural area where you don't have cellular coverage by that cell phone manufacturer? Well, then your sensor is not going to be very productive because you're not going to be able to share data. You may need a Wi-Fi ability or certain types of Bluetooth. What if that's not available? So keep in mind when you are looking at sensor technology for your needs, is there ability to actually transmit data, and where is that data going to go? We see most of our time and effort in looking at new technology, believe it or not, is spent on this issue, where we obtain devices from manufacturers believing that it will be quickly connecting to web services or downloading data to SD cards, and more times than not, we find issues with it. It just doesn't work in some cases, or the script provides what one might call buggy type of output, which requires, again, trained eyes to understand what is occurring, what type of data output is there, and is it reasonable? But again, this is where we spend most of our time. We may spend $100 on a sensor, but I can tell you sometimes we are spending thousands of dollars trying to go there and get that sensor to work so that we can evaluate it. The last point right here, again, that if you purchase some of this technology and it doesn't work for you on a communication platform, typically the only way that you're going to be able to achieve that, if the vendor is unable to provide you computer code or if they don't have the technical support to actually work you through your individual problem, you're going to have to find a local source, a skilled person who can actually look at the computer code and understand why it is not working. Don't expect the vendors to do that. We typically don't see that. That's typically on the end user in many cases. Some vendors will do that, but many will not because they just don't have the resources to provide you that handhold. What can we think about, again, replacing and supplementing regulatory data? As I said earlier, inside of the EPA and other organizations that are regulatory, we have very specific requirements for data that is used for attainment and assessment purposes. And we can't use low-cost data for that. That doesn't mean, again, that this data cannot be useful. Keep in mind that, again, there has to be certain data quality criteria associated with using low-cost sensors. As EPA as a whole, we don't tell any manufacturers your sensor is not something that we can consider for a regulatory monitor. We don't say that. It's an open call for that. But there are very specific requirements in our Code of Federal Regulations that say if you're going to be a regulatory monitor, your technology has to do the following. And there is no alleviance from that. That is, it has to meet that. But we are technology agnostic. We don't try to go there and dictate what technology is being created. We just say it has to be this good if we are to use it, and other regulatory organizations. We often see that individuals who are using data and visualizing data, reporting it, that there's often not a quality assurance plan that is in place with that data. That is, there is no quality assurance that is looking at outliers or or ensuring that it is reasonable, or comparing it with reference monitors as a method of ground truthing. We think that is a real issue because we often see sensor technology either significantly over or under reporting data. So keep that in mind. We in EPA and other regulatory organizations, we have to maintain data quality integrity all the way through the process. We often see a number of groups who are trying to provide data in a visualized format. Sometimes they are providing health messaging. We in EPA, of course, have the Air Quality Index that has been documented in a statistical means by which we are able to look and forecast health warnings based upon regulatory data. When we are seeing vendor sites that are looking at 1-minute and 5-minute data with a health warning, well, we want you to understand that the integrity of that type of health warning is different than how we in EPA have to do it, because we believe that there is a sound statistical basis for looking at that data. Short-term measurements don't carry the same degree of integrity as compared to a 24-hour based data for regulatory monitoring. So be aware and understand that there are drastic differences between those two. Here's just one example. I'm not saying good or bad about this. It's just an example. As you can see, here's a group that is issuing an air quality index, and they're using a numbering system from 0 to 12. And there's lots of different groups that will do this. But for the end user, you have to understand what is the difference between 2 and 10. How were these scales created? Is there a statistical basis behind this scale? And how do I take that scale into an understanding of how I operate my day? Here's another website. Again, we're not saying good or bad. We're just showing it as an example. Here they're indicating the 82 for ozone, and that's by their website, Excellent Air Quality. This is typically looking at a real-time measurement, and EPA, of course, we're looking at much longer measurement practices, 8 hours. At the shortest, even 1 hour basis for making a determination of where we issue health warnings. So when you start looking at really short increments of time, you have to understand what is the data assessment behind this value that says there is a statistical basis for issuing this type of messaging. Not saying that it doesn't have value, just saying that it is different to how we in the agency have to approach it. Here is another example for that. Again, it's just an example, and there are quite a few of these, and again, it doesn't mean that they cannot provide value, but you have to understand that the values being reported on screen may be drastically different than what tools associated with the Air Quality Index and other peer-reviewed organizations might provide you using the same data. So be aware. What are some of the pitfalls of these? I've spoken about them. We often see that they're using short-term measurement increments, sometimes as short as 1 minute. We don't know, and maybe it's not defined, if there's a statistical basis for those epidemiological or health assessment warnings. We don't know if there's any data quality behind this. Has there been quality assurance of the data? If so, how has that been provided? Is it raw data, or is it data that has been vetted in some means? We typically don't have any understanding of that. Information, we know that many of low-cost sensors are co-responsive. If I'm looking at an ozone sensor, it would not be unusual for it also to be responsive for nitrogen dioxide. Has that health messaging, has that taken the co-responsive feature of that particular sensor in account? I don't know. Likewise, when these sensors are being placed in situations that may or may not be intentional in terms of how the vendor wanted them to be used, is it the same type of health messaging for an indoor? Would you get the same messaging if you were trying to use it in a mobile way? Again, these are typically undefined, and we know that there are often different types of aerosols and different types of atmospheric conditions inside and outside of homes, and all of that may affect how these low-cost sensors are working. Let's talk about some of the things that we think would be of value. Certainly, being able to understand the value of low-cost sensors and the data is something, again, we see a movement by many of the users. I've given you ideas about some of the groups who are working in this area. We think that the accuracy of the sensors are extremely important. It should not just be the number that's being released on the screen, but what does that data value actually mean? In many cases, we see those values in our tests. The sensors may be reporting 100 to 200% higher than what a reference monitor might report. Again, the sensor may be co-responsive to other pollutants. Has that been taken into account? Again, a value on the screen might not necessarily mean what your true conditions are. Data quality is extremely important. And again, we see groups that are monetizing data, and at free economy society that's expected to be seen. But one has to always be of interest in how that data is being used and its integrity and data quality. Again, being able to use data purposefully is what we're all trying to achieve. But again, how does that data meet all of the requirements? One of the things that I try to share with people is here's a short summary of what we see happening across the quality assurance. These many points here: bias, precision, calibration. We've been talking about it since 2012. In 2014, we published the Air Sensor Guidebook. When we see bias, we see that most vendors do not really give an understanding of the true bias of the instruments that are being sold. Many aren't providing specification sheets that have been validated versus chamber or sensor measurement. Precision often can be quite good, but I showed you an example there earlier where 1 out of 10 sensors, the value that it was providing for us represented 300 to 400-fold different as compared to the other sensors. So precision is often good, but there are often anomalies also. And how are you going to know that that one sensor you purchased is the one that's producing the bad values? Calibration, we see in chamber-based work, both the PM and gas phase sensors often do a very good job, high degree of linearity. But unfortunately for us, the vast majority of the measurements that you and I want to take are not in a chamber. They're out in the real world. And so we always have to understand the complex issues with real-world measurements. But typically they are able to produce, at least under chamber conditions, very agreeable data reporting. Detection limits are often fairly good for the low-cost sensors. We see sulfur dioxide being one of those that typically we're looking more around the 50 part per billion level. And unfortunately, for most of the developing world, SO2 levels are far lower than 50 part per billion. So that technology just hasn't caught up as well as some of the other technologies. These sensors are typically able to respond fairly quickly, on the order of seconds to 1 to 2 minutes. That may be useful for your purpose, but again, you have to understand it's fine if you're in a static mode, but if you're trying to operate these sensors in a moving car at 120 kilometers per hour, that data is going to be very much biased by the time lag of your data. So keep that in mind. As I've said earlier, they typically can produce linearity under chamber conditions. Often we lose that linearity in the real world because of all the co-responsiveness that we see. And just to go there and move us through these things, keep in mind that often these sensors are co-responsive to relative humidity and temperature. And at least in our examination, no one can give you a definitive data point saying you can use this sensor based upon real-world tests at the following temperature settings. We see that being one of the real issues. I think you typically have to go there and obtain this hardware and then deploy it with a regulatory type monitoring situation to see when it might fail. So be aware of that. As I said earlier, there's quite a few areas that we see sensors are being used in the published literature. Here are just some of those. People are using it in a purposeful manner for public education. We see people are using it as first responders. That is, they're taking our firefighters and others are using some of this technology to warn them of hazardous conditions. People are doing personal exposure monitoring to gain an understanding about time activity pattern. But this is what the published literature would tell us as of within just the last couple of years. So quite a few categories. Unfortunately, in the published literature, work that we did last year in concert with the Patel Corporation. We examined literature from 2007 to the present, and we asked this question: what does the literature tell us about quality assurance indicators? Are people reporting that? That is, people are sharing their data in the journal articles. Do they tell what the precision and accuracy had to be before they started their research? And unfortunately, as this table shows, the vast majority of scientists, leading scientists around the world, typically are not defining key areas of data quality indicators. How fast the sensor responded, response time. You see for PM, not a single article since 2007 actually said, well, my sensor, I've got a 20-second response time of those that were included in our literature review. I won't go through all of these, but keep that in mind that we see a lot of the data quality indicators that we have to use for reference monitoring just not being reported. This doesn't mean that they're not important. It just means that we're not seeing these reported. Either people are not doing it because they're not unaware that it's important, or maybe they just don't have the ability to actually determine response times for gas phase sensors. Or they don't have the ability to go there and treat a sensor with NO2 and SO2 and CO and ozone to see if it's co-responsive. So some of the take-home messages as we close here today, we see a lot of sensor technology is being deployed around the world. We are just still in the infancy of gaining an understanding of it. We share those tools through the Air Sensor Toolbox website. I encourage you to go there almost on a weekly or monthly basis and look for new materials. We see this as a worldwide common goal. So many workshops are being developed, so many commonalities amongst leading research organizations trying to understand the usefulness of these data. And we see quite a bit of movement in groups releasing sensor data where multiple sensors are being placed out, and then trying to use that in a visualized format, or they're actually applying some sort of data algorithms to like artificial intelligence or a high degree of statistical assessment to go there and remold that data to meet a purpose. So we certainly see that. Here's some of the things that you should be aware of. There's a 2018 Sensor Performance Target Workshop, very much like the one that we conducted last June. This workshop is going to be dealing with PM10, NO2, SO2, and CO during the summer of 2019. Right now we're scheduled for July. Again, you can find the save the date when it is released, and it should be released within the next 2 to 3 weeks on the Air Sensor Toolbox website. That is a public meeting. We certainly encourage our states and other partners, international interest to attend, and you'll have the ability to attend, again, via in person and hopefully also via web for that. There's an ongoing project that we have right now. Andrea Clements is conducting this one for us here at EPA. That's our EPA Sensor Loan Program. You can, again, find out about that on the Air Sensor Toolbox website, as well as the long-term performance evaluation. We'll be providing updates about that over the next year. And again, there are other mechanisms by which you can gain an understanding of sensor technology. The 2019 Air Sensors International Conference just being one of many. That conference is being planned right now, and I'm helping provide input for that in the summer of 2019. So if you just do a search for ASIC, Air Sensors International Conference, you'll get the latest and greatest on that. I will be retiring within, a little bit from a week from now, but you will not be alone in this. Vasu Kalaru and Gail Hagler and Andrea Clements here at EPA have been and will continue to be working in the air sensors area, and here's their information. I'm sure that they will respond to your questions just as I've been lucky enough to respond to your questions over the last decade. And that's what we have for you today.
Thanks,